hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katie Mato and I am an assistant teaching professor of art history here at Abington. We are hosting this event to sort of find out a bit more about the artistic practices of our art faculty at Abington. And mostly we're going to be looking at what they've been creating during COVID-19 or since the start of the pandemic. This event will consist of a virtual group studio visit and discussion with our art faculty. And essentially, I want to begin by introducing our panelists, who will then have a few minutes to show us a couple of selected works created since the start of the pandemic. And if any questions arise during their short presentations, please feel free to ask them, ask your questions in the chat. We'll have a nice amount of time at the end to have a kind of long discussion, and I'll end up reading chats, the questions from the chats during that time. And during the discussion portion of today's event, you can either make use of the chat or you can use the raise hand function if you prefer to ask your question audibly. So like I said, I want to begin by introducing our panelists. And today we are joined by Chris Bonner, who is an assistant teaching professor of art and a ceramist. Bill Cromar, who's an associate teaching professor of art and new media artist. Don Kramlich, who is a lecturer of art and painter, sculpture, and installation artist. Yvonne Love, associate professor of art, art program chair, and sculptor and installation artist. Paul Ryder, lecturer of art and photographer, and Emily Steinberg, lecturer of art and painter and graphic novelist. John Thompson, an associate teaching professor of art and sculptor, woodworker, and installation artist, and Ricardo Zapata, lecturer of art and painter and interdisciplinary artist. I want to maybe get started with Chris. So Chris, if you can maybe talk to us a bit about what you've been working on since the pandemic. I know that some of you have works that specifically respond to some concerns that have come up during this time, and then others, from what I understand, are creating work that may kind of fall outside of that. But in any case, we are going to be looking at their artistic practices during the pandemic. So anyway, Chris, if you could get us started, that would be really great.
Great, yeah, my name's Chris Bonner. I teach ceramics. The prompt for this was, what are you doing during isolation as an artist, okay? And I thought, to be perfectly honest, I don't have any images or slides here, because I really didn't make anything. I started out, I think, after a few weeks of the pandemic, of going into the studio and making some mugs, some coffee mugs, as a comfort thing. It's kind of like baking chocolate chip cookies that, you know, it's all good for the moment, but I got a sugar buzz that just didn't feel good. So from that, I kind of left the studio and started out walking, and I did a lot of walking. I did a lot of reading. I became quite interested in mycology, the study of mushrooms, and did a lot of walking and basically foraging for mushrooms. I say all this not as quite a ramble, but for me, the pandemic has allowed me to step away from what I've been doing. And there go the lights in my studio. And allowed me to sort of focus on something out in the world that felt positive and something that I wasn't aware of. So I say all that to, it is that awareness and sort of feeling more of a bond to the world, and because it can feel pretty rough right now, was very helpful. And I say all that, and coming back into teaching in the studio, I feel like I'm ready to get on with the next phase of work. I will try to share one last thing. I had a show in the fall at Penn State Lehigh Valley, and there is a virtual tour and a webinar that I did in June of it. So I will try to share that on the chat for people that want to see my actual work. Okay, thanks guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think it's fantastic that you've maybe taken a different approach, where instead of maybe producing more than you normally would, you're kind of taking a step back. I think that's really great. And I think it's so nice to see all these different approaches to what we're all experiencing right now. Thank you. Yeah, Bill, if maybe you can go next.
Hi, everybody. There are 45 participants in this thing, and I'm really happy to share the work that our art program does this way. I don't know if we'd have that many people show up. First, we're not a Zoom-based program, so there's a silver lining for you. Well, the work that I have been kind of working on for some time has been sort of burrowed in the internet. It's been burrowed a bit in art history, and it's been burrowed a bit in thoughts that I've had about the things that go on in our world. So a lot of the work that I do is politically or socially engaged. And I came to that practice kicking and screaming, but I'm in it with both feet these days, and because here we are in it with both feet. For me, I think the pandemic was a blessing in disguise, and I don't say that lightly, knowing how much this has harmed people, but it gave me time to devote to something that I had been really wanting to learn for a long time, which was the tools that allow the different threads of my practice to kind of converge. So on the one hand, I've done a lot of work with web design and what I call web installations. That has been a bit of an isolated practice. I've done a lot of work with physical sculpture, with the translation of 3D models into physical sculpture. That has been a sort of separate thread. And I've done a lot of work with animation, and that's been a bit of a separate thread. And sometimes having those different threads can be distracting, and sometimes it can actually kind of run counter to being productive. So one thing that I discovered, I would say a couple of years ago, that I really wanted to get my feet into was something that converges all of this stuff: digital modeling, web coding, all of these things that I kind of play with. That's a technical set of tools known as 3JS and WebGL. So WebGL is kind of a driver that allows 3D models to be seen and interacted with online, and 3JS is the coding mechanism by which these things can happen. I'm not really interested in talking about the technical piece of this because it's not so interesting for people who are not like me, like nerds. But I do think the fallout of this was that I found an interesting subject that I referred to in a couple of works in the last year or so that began to take on particular resonance in the COVID world. So COVID allowed me some time to kind of take a deeper dive into a technical practice. Since my laptop is my studio in many ways, I was able to kind of not just stay productive, but actually kind of ramp it up. If you guys will permit a screen share, here I'm going to go to a web browser, and you can see the results. I'll kind of talk about this in reverse. You can see the results of this activity. For those of you who are schooled in art history, you may recognize this device, this strange-looking object, as the same device that was present in the Ambassadors by Hans Holbein the Younger, who was in many ways, weirdly, as a Renaissance artist, a new media artist, interested in the ideas of anamorphic projection, which were part of the emerging technologies of visualization at his time. So kind of consider him a great grandfather of new media. When we look at this object, we really see this strange, distorted object that's an anamorphic projection of a skull. And when you look at it from a particular point of view, you see it as the skull that it is. It's what we call a memento mori, a recognition or a remembrance that we all must die. I think something that's pretty salient in the time of COVID. I'm just going to hide some controls here and go back to the piece. So for this work, this is a 3D model that I created, derivative of a common reference object, a skull. And what this allows me to do in a browser window is it allows me to kind of click and hold and drag. You can kind of see my cursor is highlighted here. And as I click and hold and drag this object, and move it into position, we suddenly see it emerge as the skull that it is, right? So, right, it goes from this amorphous thing, right? And so this is to a kind of coherent structure. This is the memento mori done for the 21st century, done for COVID. I call it the COVID skull, but it goes by a rather stranger name, meme into maga or I. So that's what I've been working on. During the time of COVID, I've been becoming a technical wonk and converging all of the threads of my digital practice into a coherent expression. If that was coherent at all, I don't know. So I'll stop the share now.
Yeah.
And I will share in the chat. I will share the URL for that, so you can visit it in your own browser and play with the skull.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill. That was fantastic. And I like that you were able to show us how the object kind of changes depending on how you move it. That was awesome. I also liked how you mentioned that your laptop is like your studio. So you feel that you've been able to get kind of quite a bit done and almost accelerate your practice during this time. Thank you. The next person, it will be Dawn. So Dawn, if you could kind of give us a brief overview of what you've been working on, that would be great.
Apologies. I think it's important to know that my work is never tied to a single medium, nor is it tied to a specific mode of making. Rather, everything I make, everything I do is tied to being text-based. So I consider myself a text-based artist, hence being a painter, sculptor, installation artist, what have you. So I'm gonna share my screen real fast. In February of this year, my work had just taken a big turn when I completed a big 3-foot by 6-foot painting around the same time that I finished reading Rebecca Solnit's Men Explain Things to Me. It's a collection of essays in which she quotes, I believe, Chip Ward and his poignant phrase, "the tyranny of the quantifiable." That phrase really stuck with me, echoing notions of late-stage capitalism and an America whose corporate power structures posit that that which is unquantifiable lacks value to society's progress. Then COVID hit. And I found myself, as an adjunct without healthcare, too scared to leave my studio apartment, other than letting my dog out really fast or going to the grocery store once every 2 weeks. So too afraid of the risk of exposure during my 2-mile walk through the city to my art studio, I proverbially shrank to the size of my tank. So I made tiny paintings in my tiny home instead, which was yet another shift happening very rapidly in my process. To have a big shift in February and then have another forced shift in March it's not the norm for me. So I was thinking about how our economic structures have supported this tyranny of the quantifiable for so long that this pandemic stripped and laid bare our societal pitfalls. Inspired by Eva Hesse's assertion that minimalism was a metaphor for the confinement of society, I borrowed certain aspects of a minimalist aesthetic vernacular that were not anywhere in my work over the last couple of years. And I worked within the confines of a tiny panel, within the confines of my single room apartment, within the confines of COVID. So I layered the word value, making a palimpsest until it felt like a grid, an imposed structure, if you will, emerging from the word. I was trying to control the speed at which the word approaches or confronts the viewer, echoing what I see as subtle power structures inherent in language. And these led to series that I'm now doing, now that I am comfortable walking to my studio again, which are actually in encaustic, which is painting with wax.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dawn. It's funny because I'm actually reading Men Explain Things to Me right now, and I really recommend it to anyone who's looking to learn more about feminist theory or about even certain power structures inherent in society that go beyond just kind of a feminine scope. So I highly recommend it. Great, great book. And I really liked hearing about the sort of the kind of shift in scale that you mentioned and how it kind of caused you to maybe change the way that you're working towards things. And I also like how you mentioned this sort of inherent power dynamic in our language and how you're incorporating that into your work. I think that's awesome. Thank you. I want to maybe take it over to Yvonne now. So if you can tell us a bit about your work, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So the work that I'm going to show you is not typical of the work that I normally make. And I think, like Dawn, the first piece I'm going to share with you incorporates language. So I was so afraid when this all first started. These, I think I made in the end of March. These are made of porcelain, they're masks, and they have words on them sort of where your mouth might be. So the first one says shelter, wait, and stay. And those were all the things that we needed to do to remain safe. And going out for the first few times and seeing everybody in a mask was so strange to me and invoked even more fear and anxiety. The backsides of each of these masks, you can see how that anxiety played out with bite marks in the backs. And let's see. And then I had been working with, over the last year and a half, with a group of women anthropologists, poets, writers, and visual artists. And we were supposed to actually be in England in May. That did not happen because of COVID. And we were working on a series of ideas and conversations around climate change. But the two of our members actually had COVID during that time, one in England and one in San Francisco. And so some of this kind of wove into the work that we were making. And so I also am very interested in the environment. And so the installation on the left has chickadees drawn on the wall, and then this red thread, and then the red thread is around nails, and the piece says, I will stay, entangled, wait, draw, and mask. The work that I was doing there with the red thread, I was using the thread as a way to bind us together, to deliver blood, to point north while our world was falling apart, as a protective sheath. It's the lifeline for a preserver throwing out to my friends. It was the cord that I was hoping might save us, but little did I know that the world would begin to fall apart, that we would have hurricanes and fires like we've never seen. That George Floyd would die the way he did. And so my husband and I began to collaborate together. Although we've collaborated in many ways, we've never collaborated on art. So the pieces on the right are our collaborations together about George Floyd and about the lack of humanitarianism in our country and in the world. And as we were making these pieces and I began to write about things just got worse. At first I was writing about 2 hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, and suddenly there's like 5 barreling up to the country, 2 wildfires, but then the whole coast is on fire. And George Floyd led to Jacob Blake. And so in these pieces that my husband and I are working on, we have the red thread, it's tying, it's binding, and we explore kneeling. And both of us have Catholic backgrounds, and in our world, kneeling was a way of praying. And so I think we're questioning and challenging what it means to kneel. Is it to kneel in prayer? Is it to kneel in peace? Or is it to kneel in hatred and indifference?
Thank you, Yvonne. That was very powerful, and I'm glad that you brought out some of these sort of kind of difficult topics to talk about sometimes, and how your work is directly responding to that. I think a lot of the circumstances that have occurred in the past several months are really hard for people, and I think art is a way that we can kind of reflect on how society is kind of handling some of these things, and hopefully we can see how art can maybe help us create a kind of more positive future later on. So thank you for sharing that with us. I also found your masks really interesting, because I had seen them before, but I hadn't seen the bite marks on the inside, and that kind of way that they suggest the anxiety that we kind of all go through when we look outside and see how much our world has changed. When you see everybody wearing masks, there is a sense of fear, even though the mask is supposed to make us feel safe. There's something quite anxiety provoking about that. So thank you for showing that to us too. Yeah. The next person I want to talk to us is Paul.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So my name is Paul Ryder, and I do photography at Penn State, photography instructor. And my work has usually with how people live, where they live, and how we interact and deal with the circumstances that we create for ourselves in terms of the environments that we create. So since we went on COVID lockdown, and since I have moved from where I have lived for many years in the city, and that's been my experience, and always being able to just go outside and do what I do, being where we moved to, sort of out in the countryside, if you want to call it that, when the pandemic struck, it gave us a new way of looking at everything. Usually, you enjoy the place that you live with inside your home. This is your home. This is your sanctuary. But also this land that we have around us and this sort of bucolic landscape that we're in is sort of a new experience for us that we really just appreciated. This, we jokingly always call as our vacation home that we finally bought. But now all of a sudden it's like, this is our home. And so we sort of had this little bit of paradise that we've had. And with the pandemic, we got to explore it even more. With that, I realized, figuring hopefully that this pandemic was just going to be somewhat brief to a certain degree, that we would sort of come together as a nation, as a world community, and be able to solve what is going on with this problem and all come to be, I hate to use the word adults, and deal with this in a proper way. But I was looking at this as being sort of, this time period is going to be a short, brief period where we're going to be able to sit back, relax, enjoy, sort of take in all this beauty. And realistically, it was going to be sort of a blur. This is a moment that we all had to just slow down, understand where we live, appreciate where we live, enjoy the peace, the quiet, so to speak. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to show you what I've been working on. And it's a series of images that I've been doing. And it has to deal with where I live. So it's dealing with the bucolic space that I live in now. And the idea that, once again, it's going to sort of theoretically disappear. We want to get back to our crazy busy lives again and, never really sit down and spend our time dealing with it. But at the same time, it isn't going. We're still where we were 6 months ago. And with it are statements, there's news events, there's things that are constantly, in my end, listening to, reading in the newspapers, and statements that are made in the media. And I just felt that while I am living in this bucolic place, I think it's really important to sort of deal with the reality that is out there in the world. We're sort of in our own little bubble, so to speak, and having these bubbles is good, I think, healthy for us to a certain degree. A little unhealthy for some people after a while, because some people really do need the world community to be with. We need to be social animals and be with other people. But at the same time, these words that are coming out of certain people's mouths and how it's transforming things is very important. It's very serious. And I just really want to be able to almost use this as a timestamp. This is hopefully something that'll never happen again. And these words that are spoken by certain people really do have consequences. And that's the way I feel right now. So this is what I've been working on. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Paul. It was nice to hear about how your home has sort of become like a retreat, and this time has given you some space to really explore your surroundings a bit more, and so that was nice. And I also find it interesting how you say that this was hopefully a time to come together and solve some problems, and I do hope that that can still happen for all of us. But there are times when it feels a bit difficult to see that. But I think it's nice that you bring that out, right? The idea that this is a time that hopefully we can all come together in some way and create something better for the future. Thank you. So the next person I want to talk to us is Emily Steinberg.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. It's been an incredibly unprecedented time. And for me, it's been an incredibly fertile creative period. I'm actually sort of enjoying it in a huge way. The lockdown quieted down the world, and it almost took us back to the 18th century. And in January of 2020, I was fortunate enough to receive a really generous grant from the School of Visual Arts Studio for Sustainability and Social Action grant from Penn State up in main campus. And I was supposed to do a visual narrative on how we use our resources and what's going on with how we kind of abuse, in my view, abuse our natural resources. And then COVID struck. And it's sort of, it all became sort of one thing to me. The fact that COVID happened because we abuse nature and we abuse wildlife, and the disease jumped from animals to human transmission. So this whole period for me has really been about kind of how are we walking on the earth, right? I think we're walking too heavily, obviously. And so I want to share with you this visual narrative I created over the last, well, 2 months, right before I started on the reckoning. I also did quite a few other visual narrative projects. The first one was called Ring the Bells, and it was in Cleaver magazine. I also did Quarantine Journal, which was a ton of kind of one-off sort of daily journal sketches of what it was like to live during the quarantine. I also did a kind of funny take on masks called New Trends for Spring 2020, which sort of talked about different mask options for people. I did a story called In the Woods, which was a reaction to the lockdown and also Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, and how going into the woods makes all of the makings of humans go away. And so that was where I wanted to go. And I also did a collaboration with 2 British artists and a writing professor from BU called As We Are: Reflections During Lockdown, in which we all sort of did self-portraits and talked about what it was like for us. But this thing that I'm showing you here is called The Reckoning, 22 pages. And basically it's about how we have misused everything. Oops, I want to go back to that. I'm not sure how this is going to work in terms of, I'm not sure. Uh-oh, sorry, people.
Emily, you want to scroll, I think.
Yeah, it's not scroll. Oh, here we go, scrolling, yep. Okay. So how our misuse of natural resources impacts everything from climate change to how COVID was transmitted through the wet markets, how we kind of infringe on all animal habitats, and bring this on ourselves. Essentially, we have brought this moment to ourselves. We have made this lockdown happen. So, and also in this story is that the global population is on course to reach 9.6 billion people by 2050. And we will need 3 planets the size of Earth to provide enough resources to sustain us all. So I talk about factory farming, which also causes untold suffering and cruelty to sentient beings, in addition to hugely creating contributing to climate change. And I also talk about, so that's what these pages are about. I also talk about how plastic is becoming unbelievably dangerous for animals. 25% of polar bears' diets is made up of plastic because they have to search through human waste dumps. Plastic bags strangle sea lions and seals. 104 pieces of plastic were found in the belly of a baby sea turtle. We are really the scourge of the earth in a lot of ways. And I know I sound like a Cassandra, but it's how I feel. And then COVID happened. And because people in China felt the need to eat the pangolin, which is up on that image right there in the middle, the disease was transferred, lockdown happened, factories shut, roadways emptied, and all of a sudden, real change happened really fast. Like all of a sudden, on a dime, people said, I'm staying inside, I'm not going to drive. And it really had an impact on the earth. So my whole thing is, as Joe Biden is saying, we need to build back better, right? We need to take this time to build back better. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. I really like how you mentioned that we're all walking a bit too heavily on our earth right now. And I think it's great that you brought out these environmental concerns, because I think it's something that so many of us can really relate to. I think a lot of us are worried about this. So I like that your work is reflecting on that. And I also like how you brought out some humor, because I think we do need a bit of comic relief as well. So I like that you kind of initially mentioned how you did some maybe more humorous works as well, which I think is nice. So
yeah, I wish I had actually been able to show those, because they're very different in tone. Definitely a lot more lighthearted.
Yeah, maybe in the individual studio visits, if you're up for that, we can dive a bit deeper into those. Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So next, John, if you can tell us a bit about what you've been working on.
Sure. Let me do a screen share here. So my summer essentially is, well, you know, spring into summer, kind of took on two parts. So you can see in my background here, which is a fabricated background, but it is actually the place where I volunteer. I volunteer at a wooden boat shop down at Independence Seaport, and I've been doing that for about 2 years now. And I'll talk about that in a second, but essentially I wasn't able to go there. Everything shut down, and even though we're a small group there, the museum needed to shut down, and so did the shop. So I ended up inside, and I did a lot of the same things that a lot of other people did. I cooked a lot. I'm particularly proud of a pork shoulder that I made. But I also found myself really just kind of I didn't want to make artwork really. I wanted to kind of find order and organization in things, at least in my own world. So I did a lot of Legos. I ordered a lot of Legos. I can give you reviews if you want. I won't necessarily talk about anything specific. I ordered old Legos. I ordered new Legos. But there was something really cathartic in sort of like the nonverbal instruction. And so, you know, you get these numbered bags of things, and you kind of follow a visual cue, and it's all kind of physical. And that's something that, you know, for as long as I can remember, is really important to me, is just a physical connection to things in the world. So, you know, I spent a lot of time making videos for my classes, knowing that I was going to need to go virtual. I spent a lot of time cleaning out my apartment, organizing things. So it was time for me to organize myself and my life. And where I found the most pleasure was in the Legos, really. But then in August, I was able to actually go back to the shop. Like I said, I've been volunteering there for about 2 years. You know, my background is in carpentry and it's in art. I had spent a little bit of time on boats, and wooden boat building was just kind of this mystical thing to me that I just found really hard to wrap my head around. And I just decided one day that I was going to volunteer here, and it just kind of fit like a glove. I can go on and on about it, and that's for another time, but it's really the place where I'm happiest in the world. And I just love being around the people there. I love being in the place. So it fits and it feels really good. So in August, the museum opened back up in limited capacity, and so did the shop. And luckily, they invited me to do an apprenticeship last summer of 2019. And so ever since then, they've considered me an apprentice and not a volunteer. So as an apprentice, I was allowed to go back. So it's a very small group working there right now, but I just kind of wanted to show the stage that we're at, which is on the left. The image on the right is actually of the first Corinthian that the museum rebuilt before I was there. And this is the exact boat that we're building now. It'll be a different color, a little bit different outfit, but that's essentially the boat. And so we've been making progress. I go there on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes Fridays. And luckily they let me use their Wi-Fi. So if I have to have Zoom meetings, I can do that. But that's one benefit of all of this, is that I've been able to kind of work remotely and be in the place where I feel happiest and learn a skill. I think the most important thing to me is that I'm constantly learning. And so the craft of boat building has become something really important for me and much more accessible than I ever thought it was. So that's where I'm at now. And that's it. And also thank you everyone. I see that we have a good turnout. So I meant to start with that, but I guess I'll end with it. Thanks everyone for coming.
Awesome. Thank you, John. It was really fascinating to hear about what you were kind of doing at the start of the pandemic and this idea of order and organization through Legos. I think that's really cool. And to me, it shows a sense of kind of having something to help ground you. And I think a lot of us feel like we need that right now because things seem so uncertain. And I think some of us just don't really understand how to cope during this time. So I think it's really cool that you turned to something that for you allowed you to feel a sense of organization and order within this kind of these chaotic moments that we're experiencing. Cool, thanks. And then last but not least, Ricardo, if maybe you could talk to us a bit about what you've been working on since the start of the pandemic, that would be great.
Absolutely, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm Ricardo. Happy to be here, and so nice to see such a big turnout. So like many of the other people here, I kind of work in a lot of different materials, but I tend to gravitate towards 2D stuff, such as painting and drawing or a mix of painting and drawing, but I do make sculpture as well. The beginning of the pandemic was really interesting because it actually allowed me a lot more time to get into the studio. So I did find myself being very productive in what I was making and just being able to better schedule things. You know, I can Zoom here from my desk, but then within 10 minutes be in my studio working, which was really nice. Another big thing I did was I started to cycle a lot more, ride my bike. I've always been like a big bike rider, but it's been really hard to fit that into my schedule because I'm usually really busy. But since the pandemic, I've been able to ride like 10 hours a week or something. I mean, it's been pretty crazy. But you know, that with getting into the studio as well has been fantastic. So I do have an image here, or two images I put together to show kind of where my work was when the pandemic started, or what I was wrapping up, and then kind of how it went into a similar but different direction. So let me share my screen. Okay. So the image on the left, which is several, and you can't really see it because it's all glossy and reflected here, but several images of these drawings I made in series. So these were many works that I'm technically still making them. It's a series of works that are meant to be seen in series of threes. So each kind of column is kind of a row, but they all relate to each other. And it's an open-ended series. So, I'm still making them, but whenever I show them, they'll be shown in series of 3s. But they're basically these line-based charcoal and graphite text drawings. So I do work with a lot of text. They all say the same 2 words, which is love prevails. And a lot of my kind of background in text or thinking about the work does stem from my investigations into ideas of trying to find a voice for marginalized communities, or looking at the history of transgressions and how those things relate. In the past couple of years, I've been focusing more specifically on my family's history in Puerto Rico, especially since Hurricane Maria. And so looking at things like post-colonial theory and the experience of the Latinx diaspora all throughout the US and the Caribbean and the world has kind of fueled a lot of this work. So after Hurricane Maria, I was really thinking about all the things my family and I went through and how love prevailed. There was a lot of times where communication did not exist, or we couldn't really contact each other, or we were just really unsure of what was going to happen. I mean, people are still unsure of what's going to happen down there. So, thinking of and looking at some of the works by readings like Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire, this thinking about love and hope and these concepts, these big, broad concepts that can really drive how we think about the world. So with these drawings, with Love Prevails, I came up with a typography, came up with a script, and then used drawing, just little lines as a way to kind of demonstrate that. So each drawing has kind of a pattern or repetition it takes really kind of tedious. I love tedious work. It's kind of like what I do. But these kind of tedious works, but when you get to the text of where it actually says love prevails, it would force a change in my hand movement. So in this kind of act of change, or I looked at it as like rebellion, like changing the status or changing what's expected of the line quality reveals the text. So thinking about how love is actually a rebellious act, it's actually something that we use to break a mold, something that has to go against what we might even be safer for us, but can also be something that can comfort us. So I made all these drawings, and each one is different. So even though they all say the same thing, they all use different kinds of materials, different kinds of lines. Some are fast, some are slow. So they're just really nice experiments in line work and thinking about how love can prevail. And then so that was something I kind of was wrapping up around the beginning of the pandemic. Even though there's more than what's being shown here, and I want to keep doing them just to see what happens. But this is how I would present the ones I have, like at least the 12 of them that are here. And then that led to a series of paintings that are actually still ongoing. So what we see here on the right is actually just a detail. I don't really like to show the whole work until it's done, So you kind of get like a little bit of a snippet of, you can still see I have like my painter's tape and stuff on it. So, it's still in process. It's like behind the scenes look. But thinking about, during the time of Hurricane Maria, where one of the craziest things was not being able to communicate with your family members, especially in a time when we're so used to, picking up a phone or sending a text message. So having like a full week of not knowing what was happening, it was like your mother, your grandparents, was really crazy. It was really strange. But then I tried to also communicate with other people that I know, like my siblings here in the US, of trying to figure things out, but using, the digital tools we have at our disposal to try to figure things out. And that's kind of what I'm making the work about now, is looking at, the experience of using technology and communication as a way to find comfort or to find solace in things. And then it's interesting because, so I started this painting and other ones kind of like it around the middle to early part of the pandemic. And that's kind of what we're bombarded with now, right? It's like just nonstop communication. It's, these kind of like browser windows and speech bubbles and text communications. So thinking about how this over influx of communication now is such a drastic change from that moment after the hurricane, where that's all we had, but we actually wanted a lot more, right? We were desiring that. And then now it's almost kind of like we want to get away from that. So I'm trying to explore, how these kinds of communications and looking at how it relates to the experiences of my family, and looking at post-colonialism, the diaspora, notions of citizenship, notions of communication and relationship, things like that. So that's kind of where I'm going. So the pandemic has actually been really good for my studio practice. Yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I've been doing, and I might ride my bike later today if I have enough time. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricardo. It was really nice hearing about how your work comments on the experiences of marginalized communities and how you use language or words or communication as a form of rebellion. And I like the idea of love being kind of this rebellious act. I think that's such a unique but interesting and very true perspective. So I like that. Thank you for bringing that out. So we now have some time for a Q&A, and hopefully this will kind of come out as a sort of discussion. So I want to see if anyone has any questions that they want to ask our panelists. You can ask somebody a question directly, or you can ask all of them as a collective and see if any specific person wants to respond. Feel free to make use of the chat option or to use the raise your hand function, whichever you feel most comfortable with. No questions? If no one has any questions, I have a few.
I see people waving their hands. Maybe
oh, there. Okay. Yeah, I see Zoe. If you want to maybe go first. And hi, Zoe. And then I see a question in the chat as well. So Zoe, if you want to start with the questions, that would be great.
Yeah, Yvonne, I was actually really curious about your mask and the biting part of it. I was just wondering how you got that bite effect. I didn't know if you actually bit it or if you just created a similar look to it. I'm just wondering what your process was in making it.
Yeah, I'll share this screen again in case anybody, let's see. Oh, my screen sharing stuff. Anyway, I did actually bite the backs of it. So my whole family was home. I have two sons in college, and I was out in my studio, and so I would take a big bite, and then I'd have, porcelain all in my teeth and my mouth, and I'd go inside to wash my mouth, and they're all looking at me like, "What are you doing now, Mom?" But yeah, it was a bite.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you. I was just curious.
Cool. So we have another question. This is from Paige, and she asks, what is the role of the artist during this time? And I guess if any of you have a kind of answer that you want to give, that would be great.
I'd be happy to I think Katie, you might want to also answer the question, because I think that the question is answered differently. Historically, there's a role of artists in society. And personally, I don't know that I have a role. I have a role to myself. I mean, I feel like, I could have just as easily been with Chris out foraging for mushrooms. But I had this impulse that I needed to, for me, it's how I sort my thoughts and organize them. And so I need to make these things, like those masks were in my head, and I had to go and get the porcelain. I had to make these pieces. And it's an impulse. It's Chris was throwing some pots, making some coffee mugs. It's a way to soothe ourselves, and it's a way for us to resort and see and organize. So as an art maker, art is just such a strong term for me. But I don't approach the world with the intention of having a specific role myself.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think, not necessarily personally, but when I hear that question, the first thing that always comes to my mind is that Bruce Nauman piece at the PMA. It's the neon sign where it says, I think the role of the artist is to reveal hidden truths or something like that. And I think that's true, regardless of what artists do, whether you're searching for things in the forest by yourself, you're making work, whatever you're doing, you're revealing some sort of truth, whether it's to yourself or to the community. But we're always exploring, we're always searching. And I think that's our role.
Yeah.
I agree with Ricardo a bit. I see myself as a digester, right? And I'm digesting what's around me at all times. And like Yvonne, I do have these urges to sort of organize that information in some way through my work. But I agree with Ricardo that these impulses, whether they are revealing truths to ourselves or others, like that is, at the end of the day, I think a great unifier of a lot of different artists' practices. Yeah.
I'll try to weigh in. It's a bit noisy. I'm in the makerspace today, and you all are welcome to come because we're open. But to expand on that, one, I think that's the only piece that that Bruce ever made that was actually sincere. Ricardo, number one. People think it's a joke, but it's not. And number two, I think the mystic truth is a personal one. So I think the role of the artist does not change regardless of the time. I think the role of the artist is to have the spectator see the world through the artist's eyes, no matter what. And the times that we live in are hideous to see. I don't know what else I can offer, but to know that role doesn't really change for me.
Yeah, thank you all for your answers. I think these were really insightful. And I think although artists can absolutely respond to current situations, I don't think that they can promise to create change. I think that responsibility falls in the spectators. So I think we as spectators and as artists too, our role is to maybe consider and respond to what artists are proposing. So to think about what they're doing and then maybe act. So for me, I think a big kind of part of this is on the spectator and what we do after we see something. So for me, it's important to also consider our role as viewers and how we're going to move forward after we see something that kind of challenges maybe the way that we think or the way we feel and what we do after that. But thank you, Paige. That was a really good question. Wendy, you have a question specifically for Ricardo. I don't know if you want to ask that now or afterwards, but there's time if you want to do that now. Okay, I'll go to the next question then. So the next one is, this is from Megan, and she asks, what has been the most challenging part of physically creating art in the COVID environment? And this is something that I think a lot of you can probably respond to.
Mine is pretty brief. The physical challenge has been so overwhelming that I don't make physical work, I make digital work. So that's a cop-out, but that's that's my business.
Mm.
I'll respond to that. I know for one class, I ordered clay in March and it was available for pickup in June. So, just the physically trying to get materials as one example of not being able to. So that's certainly a challenge, or was.
Yeah, I think that differing access is part of the reason that mine shifted, right? I ended up just grabbing these chunks of wood that I already have, sanding them down, gessoing them, and turning them into a panel that was workable because I couldn't go and, ask my buddy Doug, who usually makes my panels.
For me, I think the building of anxiety was so intense and there were so many things happening so constantly. Normally I keep myself in a pretty regular rhythm, keep things, relatively even. And I think sometimes I got so anxious that it just got in my way and I had to come up with something new, which was good. So a lot of meditation and a lot of breathing. But I would say the anxiety of COVID coupled with the environment and coupled with what is going on with racism in our society has just toppled me.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of difficult time for some people, and I found it interesting how others thought that it was more conducive to them being able to get a lot of work done. So it's interesting to see how everybody has a different way that this has impacted them and their work. Absolutely. I then want to turn to Judy's question, and Judy asks, as you teach our students, have you noticed their perceptions of COVID in their artwork? If yes, are they optimistic or focused on the negative?
I think I've seen, some changes in the work students have made. Unfortunately, I can't say I've seen a lot of optimism, but, I do see changes. It seems like a lot of students, being stuck, being isolated, that seems to be coming out in some of the work I've seen. But, I wouldn't call it a bad thing. I think, it's the work that they're making is a way to kind of channel or get through this time or this experience. So I think it's important, but it has changed. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricardo. I can imagine that a lot of students are responding to the pandemic, and I can see where maybe some of them are responding in a way that seems a bit more negative, or bringing out the kind of difficulties that they're experiencing. Chris, were you gonna say something?
Well, I wanted to respond to Judy's. I have 3 in-person classes. And what I would say is that, I don't see it in the work, but I do see the students, I think, seeing them happy to be here and in person and working. Like my class is I hope, somewhat of an escape from other tough stuff, and this is a place to come and just sort of explore and have the headspace to do that. And the students are showing up and they're coming in and working, and so it's not that they're making work in response, but I think it's helpful to them. That's all I'd say.
I'd kind of like to piggyback a little bit on what Chris is saying, because I also am teaching in person, and for my students that are here, I see a lot of you here today. I do dive into a lot of content-oriented work with my students, but I've really, I've been making art for as long as I can remember. And so I'm sort of seasoned in, hitting some issues head on. And, I'm happy for I'm not asking those questions this semester of any of the things that I just talked about, where normally I would be, because I feel like it is absolutely so overwhelming. And so whatever the students want to bring to the table, I'm there for, but we haven't gone there at all. So, and I'm happy for them to have the space to come and do what they want to do right now in the studio.
Awesome. Thanks, Yvonne, for bringing that out. So we're almost out of time. We are out of time. I know John and I had sort of spoken about potentially having the discussion go on a bit longer for those people who were able to stay. So I don't know if that's something that a few of you would be interested in, but we have kind of one more question that I think is definitely worth addressing. And that is, did anyone experience any art block? And I think that was a question I had too, where what did you do when you were feeling uninspired? If that ever did happen, how would you kind of work through that kind of emotion?
I think I can answer that, at least from my point of view. I had the opposite of art block, even though I said, I didn't really want to make art. Where things started with me from the boat, working on boats, was that I was using the imagery of boats and the stories of boats in my own work as metaphors for things. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll make, actual models of boats using traditional methods. And then that led into me being like, well, why am I building models? Why not build a real thing? And so I kind of returned back to that original idea, and I was like, wow, now's the time. I can't go to the boat shop. What do I do? And so I kind of returned to that idea of building these paper models, and also just seeing how, I watch a lot of YouTube, just seeing how creative people were getting with all kinds of things that COVID created a lot of problems that needed answers, especially in communication. And, we can definitely argue that visual art is a form of communication. And so for me, I also make a lot of really bad art. I think that's the problem with art block, is that people are afraid to make something bad. But I think that COVID actually, I experienced the opposite of art block. I felt that there were conversations to have, and I saw other people having conversations. And although I was organizing things, it was still there in me to kind of pursue those things.
That's great, John. Thanks. Does anyone else have any response to the
Can I
question?
piggyback on John's response?
Yeah.
I just want to actually, I had the same experience. I had a total non-art block. I had like a creative sort of brain on fire thing in response to this thing. It was like just moving from one aspect of it to another. So for me, it was like an incredibly fertile thing. And because I'm working just drawing and doing a lot of stuff digitally, there was really no issues with space or anything. So it was an amazing time.
Awesome.
For me,
Go ahead, Paul.
so for me, actually, it was sort of this wonderful time to just go back and look at a lot of projects that are just sort of started. I just leave in mid-process. A lot of times I start a project and I just need to think about it, put it aside. And this was a perfect time for me to look back at a lot of these projects that I have started and trying to figure out where I'm going with them, how I want to, you know, transform them or continue on the lines I was going. It was just really nice to be able to do that. Just take the time to just, you know, make a print, look at the print, put it up on the wall, stare at it for a while, and not feel any kind of like pressure that I actually have to like produce this serious body of work. Just really look at it and just really just think about it. One of the things I enjoyed was just, you know, walking around my space because I was looking at it for the first time really in a different eyes and just enjoying things. So that was sort of the artistic aspect. And for me, it was just having fun, just relaxing to a certain degree. I didn't want to make anything overly serious. So like the words that came into that project is the seriousness, but it's the seriousness of the times. But, you know, having said that, my major project that I actually did when COVID first hit was I had to build a rain garden. It was needed, and it was this big pit in the front of our yard that we had to dig, and it was sort of therapeutic. It was great, and it was something that needed to be done, and now it's beautiful because it's filled with beautiful flowers, and it performs its function wonderfully.
Awesome. Dawn, I think I saw that you were going to say something earlier.
Yeah, I think for me, it was a really hard thing to learn, but I eventually got there. Shifting my internal understanding of a period in which I'm not making much work, away from the idea of calling it art block and toward this idea that I am always working insofar as the work is me, I am the work, it is coming from my mind. And so even if there is this period of a couple of months where I'm not really making anything, or I'm only making 2 minuscule paintings when normally I would have made 5 in the same amount of time, it's still the fact and the case that my mind is digesting. And so that period in which I wasn't making much work isn't so much art block, it's my mind being given the space to catch up to my hand. And once I learned that lesson, I am now able to get back into the studio and, to John's point, make failures and celebrate them, because those failures are the only way that I can get to the stronger work. And it's sort of this ebbing and flowing, right? That like my mind does the digesting and then my hand does the digesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you kind of signal this almost like a shift in perception that removes some of that pressure where you think, oh, if I'm not producing all the time, I have art block. And in this case, you're saying maybe we shouldn't be reading it like that, but instead it's more about me kind of taking care of myself and realizing that I have a role as an artist to kind of think about things in a deep way. And I don't always have to be producing something. And just because I'm not doesn't mean I necessarily have some sort of block. It's just part of the process. So I like that.
Right. And like trusting that your brain and your subconscious are always working,
Mm-hmm.
and that will eventually become, right?
Yeah, I like that. Does anyone else have any comments on that final question? Yeah. Ricardo, I think I see your hand up.
I just want to jump in and say I apologize. I need to beg leave, but thank you for organizing this, and it's been a pleasure to chat with everybody.
Yeah, awesome. Bye, Bill.
Bye, Bill. I just want to say I agree with what everyone's saying. You know, I also think that, and it goes with my own practice, that I'm not always working. You know, like I will get in the studio and go crazy, you know, for like months on end, but then I'll have months where I don't do anything. I've had to stop feeling guilty about that. And I've had to learn that that's okay. And it is actually part of my process. Like everything I do goes in cycles, you know. But in those slow times, there are periods, like Don was saying, of digestion and thinking. You know, so much of, I think, my practice and a lot of people's practice is to just think about things and reflect on things. And one thing I do that I think maybe can help some students with the idea of artist block is I like to make a lot of lists, you know, lists of ideas. And a lot of these ideas are terrible. Or I can just be walking around and think, oh, I like the way that looks, or I like this idea, or I like this color. I mean, just really simple things, and I write it down. And so whenever I do have these weird moments where I don't feel productive, I explore one of those dumb ideas, you know. And, you know, you have to just not be scared to make bad work. You know, in order to make good work, you got to make a lot of bad work. So don't put art on the pedestal, you know, in that sense. Don't think that every time you do something, it's got to be precious and amazing and genius. You know, that comes after the fact. Just work and do anything, and it's going to take you somewhere, you know.
Lists helped me so much too, Ricardo. I literally have a pad of paper that says at the top, I love lists. That is a core of my practice. And yeah, I agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, and it makes it fun for me because, you know, I write all these little ideas, or even just, you know, a word or something, and thinking about, you know, I want to draw this word, and yeah. I write it down. And, you know, I have so many of these weird little notes and lists that when it's time for me to sit down and look at them and think about them, I've already forgotten them. And so when I see the list, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember having that thought. And so it feels fresh again. And then it's a way to kind of spur movement in that direction.
Even and because I, like you, forget by the time I return to them anything of what I had written down, I end up collating them and realizing that there's a pattern. And anytime there's a pattern, that's what I know I need to dig into next. And that's Absolutely. What I meant by like the subconscious is working. You're recognizing and digesting these patterns over time. And during that lull, if we want to call it that, in the studio, you got to trust that your brain is still doing that work. And so all of these random notes, whether it's on a napkin or my I love list pad or my iPhone note as I was like headed to my car, there's generally some sort of pattern that emerges, and that's the work.
Yeah, awesome. I think this is really great advice. And I like how you both brought out this idea that students really shouldn't be afraid to experiment and to sometimes fail, because often the really good stuff comes out of multiple failures that happened before that people just don't really talk about. So thank you both for bringing that out. I think we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you all so much for joining us today. I also want to give a special thanks to our panelists. You were all fantastic. It was wonderful to see all of the exciting things you have been working on during the pandemic. And to all of you who joined us, thank you so much for coming. And to the ones who were unable to make it, please be on the lookout for future events. We're hoping to host individual studio tours with our panelists. So it would be great for you to join us. We had such a nice turnout. So I hope that continues to happen throughout this series. Thank you again for attending, and I hope you have a really nice rest of your day.